In our phase 3 program, it also demonstrated that there was a good safety profile and a good efficacy profile. In fact, I will go even further to say Pfizer's enrollment of the Black population, I think it was 9.2%, was the only subpopulation that demonstrated no additional after the second dose, 7 days after the second dose, the only population that had no evidence of COVID at all. So exceptionally pleased with that. When you say, I'm not sure if this is safe, I'm not sure if I have confidence that I can take this vaccine, what you should also ask yourself is, why didn't I participate earlier? Because then I would have confidence, then there would be data on me. That being said, I do feel confident in their phase 3 program, certainly looking at the data that was submitted to the FDA for Pfizer, that it appears to be both safe and efficacious in the Black population.
There was an interesting study released recently by MIT Labs where they looked at the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine for particular racial groups. And they did find that there was a difference in efficacy of the vaccines. And I want to say it was about 9% difference in efficacy for African American populations. You know, what we have to be very careful about are myths and misconceptions that come from data that we don't really understand. And so when we see small variations of efficacy based upon race and ethnicity, is the conclusion that Black people shouldn't get the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, that's absolutely not the conclusion. In fact, I would conclude the opposite. We definitely should get the vaccine. And I think, you know, one of the questions that I get frequently is this Operation Warp Speed. And what does it mean? And did the vaccine get developed too fast? And can we trust it? And so, you know, I sort of want to peel the onion back on that a little bit, because the fact of the matter is vaccine development generally is an 8 to 25 year process. So how do we get this done in 11 years? In 11 months, I'm sorry. So part of that is when you look at R&D, research and development in companies, there's a lot going on for years before you see it. And so when we look at the SARS virus, severe acute respiratory syndrome virus from 2003, we began to gather a lot of information from that SARS outbreak. That was our SARS outbreak of 2003. This is, 17 years later. By the time this virus, the SARS-CoV-2, is why we call it 2, coronavirus 2, because number 1 was the one in 2003, we had completed all of the preclinical work, all of the bench work. It was the reason that we already knew the spike protein was the area of the virus that should be targeted. All of that work had been done. We already knew the spike protein was 30,000 base pairs. We had a ton of information, but that's 17 years of research. And so then when we began to have this outbreak and they say, oh, we sat around for a weekend and sort of, came up with this, that weekend was based on 17 years of work that had already been done. And that we already knew that we could target the spike protein. We already knew that it was 30,000 base pairs. We understood how we could use messenger RNA to trigger the body to create these proteins. So yes and no. It was fast, and yet it wasn't. Behind the scenes, which is often the case, what's really going on behind the scenes instead of what's out in front of the cameras. Behind the scenes, that's 17 years. If I were to roll that back even further, people have been doing research specifically looking at messenger RNA as an opportunity to move forward in vaccines since the 90s, the early 90s. We began to question whether we could do that. Labs began to sort of take a look at that. And so it doesn't just sort of pop up on the screen. It looks that way. And yet we got a really head start on it in 2003 with our first SARS outbreak.
So when and under what circumstances or situations am I not going to or want to take the vaccine?
Yeah, and that's a more loaded question than you think. I think distribution is going to be very important, especially within our medical centers. When we take a look at the COVID vaccine distribution within our medical facilities, and we look at the people who are coming first, our frontline healthcare workers, nurses, and physicians, many of whom will be from the African American community, we could not afford to have them opt out of this COVID vaccine because of fear. We cannot have them afford to take a step back, not because we don't care about them. The reason we can't afford it is because they are a part of our ecosystem. And for us to be successful, we need to be able to achieve herd immunity within our ecosystem of the hospitals. And so we can't afford to have entire populations of people say, thanks, but no thanks. We all have to be able to step forward and move this message forward, reach out to people who have fear, who have reticence. I mean, it's more than vaccine hesitancy. I actually am almost amused when I hear that, vaccine hesitancy. It's a very nice term that maybe we can use in 10 years. That completely does not encompass what the Black person thinks when they think about vaccines and clinical trials. But when we are within medical centers and we're developing our distribution teams and how vaccines are going to be distributed, whether we're going to have enough for people, who's going into the lottery, who's not going into the lottery, we've got to start at the very beginning of developing these teams with a very strong messaging and outreach to everybody who's on the front lines. If we can't get all these people to step up and take the vaccine and they become ill, we're already stretched with resources. We don't have people to fill in their positions. The hospitals are near or at capacity, and we have populations that don't want to take the vaccine. We've got to begin that messaging well ahead of any vaccine ever reaching your medical facility.